Pope Leo XIV had broken protocol before, but what he was carrying in his heart this dawn would shatter every expectation the world held about papal authority. The burden pressed against his chest like a stone as he walked the ancient paths of the Vatican gardens, his worn black shoes silent on the dew-dampened gravel, the weight of unspoken truth growing heavier with each step. The gardens held their breath in the pre-dawn darkness, cypress trees standing like sentinels against a sky still heavy with night. No birds sang yet. Even the fountains seemed muted, their waters whispering secrets to the shadows. Leo moved through this sacred silence like a man carrying the world's pain in his pocket. Prayers of pontiffs for centuries. 3 months, 93 days since he had accepted the keys of Peter, and still the words remained locked inside him, the words that needed to be spoken. He celebrated private mass each evening as he knelt before the crucifix in his simple quarters. The world was breaking apart, nations at each other's throats. Families torn by hatred had said nothing. His fingers found the small wooden cross hanging at his chest, a gift from the dying woman in Peru who had whispered, "Speak for us when you can, Father." She had pressed it into his palm with hands that shook not from age but from hunger, and he had promised, before the white vestments, before the throne, before the protocols and the politics and the careful diplomatic language that said everything and nothing, the fountain of the Madonna. The water caught the early light like tears. In the distance, he could see the silhouettes of Swiss guards beginning their morning rounds, the Vatican stirring to life with its careful rhythms and ancient certainties. But certainties were luxuries he could no longer afford. The letters hidden in his desk drawer, thousands of them now testified to a world that needed more than careful statements and measured responses. They needed truth, raw, unfiltered, dangerous truth, the kind that could change everything. Their shrill persistence cutting through the pre-dawn quiet like accusations. Sarah Chen, the network's Vatican correspondent, stood before a wall of monitors displaying global chaos missile strikes in Eastern Europe. Felt the familiar burn of deadline pressure mixed with something else entirely. Bewilderment. Everything that matters. No statements, no calls for peace, no PayPal diplomacy, nothing. Across the Tiber, the mood in the Vatican press office was equally tense, but far more confused. Father Alessandro Toretti, the Holy See's director of communications, paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his usually pristine cassock wrinkled from another sleepless night. The stack of interview requests had grown so high it threatened to topple from his desk, BBC. Every major network demanding the same thing, access to a pope who seemed to have vanished into prayer. "He's not sick," Toretti said into his phone for the dozenth time that morning, his Italian accent thickening with frustration. "No, he's not avoiding the media. Yes, he's aware of the global situation. No, I cannot predict when His Holiness will issue a statement." But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. In 20 years of Vatican service, he had never encountered a pontiff so immune to the rhythms of modern papal communication, mysteriously silent about the world, burning beyond the Vatican walls in Jerusalem, Tokyo, Washington, and London. Newsroom editors stared at the same empty PayPal calendar. The betting pools in Fleet Street had shifted from predicting what the Pope would say to whether he would say anything at all. Social media buzzed with hashtags, #SilentPope, #WhereIsPapai, #SpeakLeo XIV. But inside the Apostolic Palace, in rooms where whispers carried the weight of centuries, even the cardinals who had elected him were beginning to wonder. Cardinal Martinez, his closest advisor, had spent the previous evening trying to convince Leo to at least release a prayer for peace. Something, anything. The Pope had simply smiled, touched the wooden cross at his throat, and said, "When the moment comes, Alessandro, you'll know." The moment for what? Nobody could say. The lamplight in Leo XIV's private study cast long shadows across the room where centuries of papal decisions had been made. But tonight, the weight of history felt particularly heavy. Cardinal Alessandro? Martinez sat across from the Pope's simple wooden desk, his usually composed face etched with concern as he spread. "Holy Father," Martinez began, his voice careful but urgent. "The Secretary of State has prepared 3 different statements, mild, moderate, and strong." Pope Leo's interruption was gentle but firm. He hadn't touched the papers. "They want to hear from the Pope." But which Pope? Alessandro, the one they expect, or the one God is calling me to be. Martinez leaned forward, 20 years of Vatican diplomacy tensing in his shoulders. With respect, the distinction is a luxury we cannot afford. The world is watching. Every hour of silence damages our moral authority, our ability to influence. Leo set the cross down gently, his eyes finding Martinez's across the flickering lamplight. Tell me, my friend, what influenced you most when you were a child in Barcelona? Was it the grand pronouncements from Rome, or was it your grandmother praying the rosary in her kitchen? The cardinal's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. They had danced this dance before, Leo's questions that somehow turned diplomatic urgency into spiritual examination. Holy Father, personal anecdotes don't stop missiles. Pastoral reflection doesn't feed refugees. Basilica loomed against the Roman night. His reflection in the glass looked older than his 62 years, carved hollow by the weight of words unspoken. The world has heard plenty of words, Alessandro, beautiful words, careful words, diplomatic words that say everything and change nothing. What if he paused, his hand finding the window's cool surface? Something different. Different how? Martinez's voice carried a note of alarm now, the alarm of a man who had built his life on the certainties of institutional wisdom. Leo turned back to his oldest friend, and in his eyes Martinez saw something. That made his breath catch not doubt, but terrifying clarity. What if the truth they need isn't wrapped in diplomatic language? What if it's simpler than that, more dangerous than that? Like prayers made tangible, their paper thin and sometimes stained, their words written in hands that shook with hunger, fear, or desperate hope. Leo XIV sat in the pre-dawn quiet of his study. The diplomatic cables Martinez had left untouched, while he read the correspondence that bypassed and aid workers who understood that some truths couldn't wait for official channels. Holy Father began one letter written in careful English on notebook paper. My name is Amara, and I am 16 years old. The bombs fell on our school yesterday, but I am still alive. My teacher, Sister Catherine, said, you might hear me if I write. I don't need you to stop the war. I just need you to know we are here. Leo's fingers trembled as he set the letter aside and reached for another. This one written in Spanish on the back of a medical form. Papa Leo, the soldiers took my husband 3 months ago. My children ask when Papa is coming home. I tell them, God knows, but I think God has forgotten our village. Please remember us, Maria Elena Vasquez. The sanitized diplomatic reports spoke of regional tensions and humanitarian concerns. But these pages bled with real names, real faces, real children who drew pictures of their destroyed homes in the margins. It's a mother in Yemen. Watching her baby grow thinner each day, a priest in Syria wrote with hands that still shook from pulling bodies from rubble. A grandmother in Ukraine sent a photo of her granddaughter's empty bedroom, the child's toys scattered by shrapnel. Leo had started reading them 3 weeks ago, drawn by an instinct he couldn't name. Now they consumed his mornings. These voices from the edges of the world were diplomatic language dissolved into desperate pleas, ones in a wooden box beside his bed, reading them again before sleep, carrying their words into his dreams. One letter stopped him completely. Dear Pope Leo XIV, my mama says you talk to God. Can you ask him why he made the bad men hurt my papa? I still pray every night, but I think maybe God is too busy with important people to listen to me. The letter fell from Leo's hands as something broke open inside his chest. He finally understood what God had been preparing him for all these silent weeks. The world didn't need another careful statement. It needed someone willing to carry their pain into the light. The Sistine Chapel was never meant to be entered alone, especially not at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. But Leo XIV walked through its doors without announcement, without escort, carrying only the wooden cross from Peru and the weight of 10,000 unread letters that had found their way into his heart. The maintenance worker polishing the marble floor looked up in shock, his elderly face cycling through confusion, recognition, and panic in rapid succession. Your Holiness, I forgive me. I didn't know should I call security. No need, Giuseppe. Leo's voice was soft, almost whisper quiet in the vastness. Seemed important. Continue your work. Pretend I'm not here. But pretending was impossible in this space where Michelangelo's creation of Adam stretched overhead, where God's finger nearly touched the first man's in an eternal moment of divine contact. Leo moved slowly down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing despite his attempt at silence, each sound seeming to ask the ceiling's painted figures, "What now? What am I supposed to do with all this pain?" Of his eye, in 30 years of cleaning these floors, he had never seen a pontiff enter alone, never witnessed the raw vulnerability that seemed to emanate from Leo XIV. Even the frescoes seemed to lean in, centuries of painted saints and prophets witnessing this moment of papal solitude. Leo's hands found the wooden cross at his throat, and he closed his eyes, letting the silence of the holy space wash over him like absolution. Here, surrounded by the church's greatest artistic achievements, he felt smaller than he had in the gardens at dawn, not diminished, but clarified. "The dying woman in Peru," he whispered to the painted ceiling, his voice so low Giuseppe had to strain to hear it. She said, "Speak for those who have no voice." But how? How do I carry their suffering without breaking? How do I tell the truth without destroying everything? The kind of divine weight that had once moved prophets to speak uncomfortable truths to uncomfortable times. Leo remained kneeling as minutes stretched into an hour, the chapel's ancient stones absorbing his prayer like a sponge, when he finally rose. Giuseppe noticed something had changed in the Pope's Beringa straightening of shoulders, a steadiness in his step that hadn't been there before. Something had been decided in that silence. The private chapel, adjoining Leo XIV's quarters, was barely larger than a confessional, its single stained glass window casting jeweled light across a simple wooden altar. It was here, in the hour before dawn, when the Vatican still slept, that the Pope knelt on bare stone and finally heard the voice he had been waiting for, not in words. Letters lay spread before the altar like an offering of Mara's notebook paper, Maria Elena's medical form, the child's careful printing, asking why God seemed too busy for small prayers. Of desperate hope beneath his palms. 3 months of diplomatic pressure, of Cardinal Martinez's careful urgings, of the world's expectation that he speak in the measured language of papal authority, all of it fell away in the silence. Not their words, he whispered to the crucified Christ hanging above the altar. Mine, not their careful diplomacy, truth, raw, unfiltered truth. The decision, when it came, was not a flash of divine inspiration, but a quiet recognition of what he had always known. The woman in Peru had pressed this wooden cross into his hands and said, "Speak for us, not speak about them. Not speak around them. Speak for them in their voice, with their pain carrying their hope." He remained kneeling as the first light of dawn touched the chapel window, and when he finally rose, his movements carried a new certainty. The letters he gathered carefully, reverently, placing them back in their wooden box. These voices would not be filtered through Vatican diplomacy or softened by ecclesiastical language. They would be heard exactly as they were written, human, real. An hour later, his secretary knocked hesitantly on the study door. "Your Holiness, Cardinal Martinez is here for your morning briefing." Looking up from the notebook where he was writing in his own careful hand, "Cancel everything for today, Holy Father." Leo set down his pen and looked up, and his secretary stepped back at what he saw in the Pope's eyes, not confusion or wariness, but the kind of terrifying clarity that had once sent prophets into the wilderness and martyrs to their deaths. "Need you to contact the Vatican Television Center," Leo said, his voice steady as stone. "Tell them I'll need a direct global broadcast. Tonight, no prepared remarks, no teleprompter, no script, just me and a camera. But Your Holiness, protocol." "Requires protocol," Leo said gently, "is exactly what we're going to abandon." The Vatican Television Center had never experienced anything quite like the chaos that erupted when Pope Leo XIV walked through its doors at 9:15 on a Wednesday morning, unannounced and carrying a small wooden box under his arm. The production manager, Marco Benedetti, nearly dropped his espresso as he watched the Vicar of Christ bypass every security protocol and stride purposefully toward the main broadcast studio. "Your Holiness," Marco stammered, his morning routine of equipment checks and scheduling meetings suddenly meaningless. "We weren't expecting, we have no scheduled broadcast today, and the crew isn't prepared for. How long do you need to reach every network globally?" Leo's question cut through the technical babble like a blade. He set the wooden box carefully on the control room desk, his calm demeanor more unsettling than any PayPal rage. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, all of them. "How long?" Marco's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Well, Your Holiness, it depends on the content, the approval process. The Secretary of State's office would need to review 30 minutes. An hour? Leo's eyes held that same terrifying clarity his secretary had witnessed earlier. I'm not asking about approval processes, Marco. I'm asking about satellites and fiber optic cables. A television or computer can hear what I have to say. The control room erupted in whispered Italian as technicians looked between their equipment and the Pope with growing alarm. Cardinal Martinez burst through the doors. Moments later, his usually composed face flushed with panic and exertion. Holy Father, please, whatever you're planning, we need to discuss it first. The implications of an unscripted PayPal address 3 months, Leo said quietly, his hands resting on the wooden box that contained Amara's letter and all the others. Die and mothers weep. No more discussions, Alessandro. No more careful words that change nothing. The television crew watched this exchange with the fascination of people witnessing history pivot on a single moment. Camera operators checked their equipment instinctively, sensing that whatever was about to happen would be worth recording. Need 2 hours to notify the networks? Marco said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe less if I tell them it's urgent PayPal business. A black backdrop. Tell them the Pope has something to say that he's never said before. Behind him, Cardinal Martinez sank into a chair as the weight of what was coming settled over the room like a thundercloud. The red light on the camera blinked on at exactly 6 o'clock. Rome time, and across the globe, television screens filled with an image that no one expected. Pope Leo XIV sitting in a simple wooden chair. No ornate backdrop, no PayPal regalia, just a man in white holding a small wooden box in his lap. Camera with eyes that seemed to see through the lens into every living room, every heart watching. My name is Leo, he began, his voice so quiet that viewers around the world instinctively leaned closer to their screens. Before I was Pope Leo XIV, before I wore white, before I carried the keys of Peter, my name was simply Leo. And tonight, I want to speak to you not as the vicar of Christ, but as someone who has been carrying your pain for 3 months and can no longer bear the weight of your silence alone. In newsrooms from London to Tokyo, anchors fell silent. No Latin phrases, no diplomatic language carefully crafted to offend no one and inspire nothing. Cardinal Martinez, watching from the control room, gripped his rosary until his knuckles went white. Leo opened the wooden box and withdrew a piece of notebook paper. Girl named Amara. Her school was bombed. Her teacher was killed. His voice cracked slightly on the word exists, and something shifted in the quality of silence around the world. In a cafe in Paris, conversations stopped. In a hospital waiting room in Mumbai, families gathering around a mounted television felt tears they couldn't explain. In a refugee camp in Jordan, aid workers huddled around a phone, streaming the broadcast and recognized something they had never heard from. For me to speak about wars and violence, about politics and diplomacy, the world doesn't need another careful statement from the Vatican. You need to know that someone sees you. The letter in his hands, then back at the camera, and in that moment, something ancient and prophetic entered his voice. Tonight, I want to read you their names. All of them. Desk. In a diner in Detroit, the late shift cook turned up the volume on the television mounted above the grill. Her spatula frozen mid-flip as Pope Leo XIV read Amara's letter word for word, his voice carrying the tremor of barely controlled emotion. The burger patties began to smoke, but she didn't notice. Neither did the trucker at the counter, who had stopped mid-bite, the usual urgency of catching the next train forgotten. A businessman missed 3 consecutive departures, transfixed by the sight of the most powerful religious leader in the world, reading handwritten, continued through speakers and screens around the globe, whose husband was taken by soldiers 3 months ago, who's loved that his children still wait by the window each evening. In a refugee camp outside Amman, aid workers gathered around a tablet connected to spotty Wi-Fi. Known a world without war, felt tears on her cheeks for the first time since she had arrived. The Pope's broadcast had not been scheduled, had not been announced with the usual PayPal fanfare, yet somehow it was reaching every corner of the connected world. On social media, the constant chatter of outrage and opinion gave way to something unprecedented. Silence punctuated only by shared clips and the simple message, "Listen to this. Granddaughter's bedroom had been destroyed by shrapnel." The man thought of his own daughter asleep 3 floors above him in their apartment, safe in a way that now felt like a miracle rather than a right. Wooden box. Their stories matter. Their pain is not statistics to be managed or problems to be solved through diplomatic channels. They are human beings crying out to be seen. And for the first time in memory, the whole world was listening, in suburban kitchens and apartment living rooms, processing what they had just witnessed. But the reverberations continued to spread like ripples in still water. Margaret Chen. "Did you see it?" she asked when the phone was answered. Every moment of compassion she'd withheld from the people closest to her, in a maximum security prison in Texas. Television experienced something none of them had expected: recognition. How to Cry found tears on their cheeks. "He sees us," one whispered to another. "Even us." Officials struggled with the implications of a religious leader abandoning diplomatic protocol. Team, how do we respond to a pope who just read victim impact statements on global television? But even as they crafted careful statements, through the children's ward, when Leo read the letter from a Syrian grandmother describing her grandson's last words, she had written a similar letter herself 3 months ago, never expecting it to reach Rome, certainly never imagining it would be read aloud to the world. In favelas and housing projects, had never felt heard by institutions, began to understand that their stories mattered to someone who mattered. A teenage gang member in Los Angeles called his grandmother for the first time in months. Really seeing them? The shift was subtle but undeniable. The space of one evening, Leo XIV had reminded the world that behind every statistic was a name. Behind every policy debate was a human face. Midnight approached. Cardinal Martinez found the Pope kneeling in his private chapel, the empty wooden box beside him. The letters had all been read, all been heard. The real work was just beginning. The Vatican's corridors had never hummed with quite this frequency of urgent whispers. 12 hours after Pope Leo XIV's unprecedented broadcast, his voice strained with exhaustion and something approaching panic. Americans want assurances that this wasn't, what did they call it, a mental health episode. Down the hall, Father Alessandro Martinez sat across from 3 fellow cardinals. No doctrine, just letters from civilians. "Exactly," Martinez replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his words. Despite his institutional alarm, he couldn't shake the memory of watching Leo read those letters, the raw authenticity that had made diplomatic. How do you respond to a religious leader who has abandoned the careful language of interfaith diplomacy in favor of reading victim testimonies on global television? The British Foreign Secretary drafted 3 different statements before abandoning them all. Each one sounded hollow against the memory of Leo's voice speaking Amara's name. The problem confided the French ambassador to the Vatican to his aide over secure phone. Me crying after watching it. How do you argue with that kind of moral authority? Indeed, the grudging admiration was spreading, even among those whose job it was to maintain institutional order. A senior cardinal who had initially drafted a letter of concern found himself deleting it after his own nephew, an aid worker in South Sudan, called to say that Leo's broadcast had given him hope for the first time in months. The most telling response came from Archbishop Williams in Canterbury, who released a brief statement. "His Holiness has reminded us that the Church's first calling is not to be diplomatically correct, but to be prophetically honest," even as Vatican lawyers worked overtime to assess potential diplomatic damage. Even as world leaders struggled to craft responses to a pope who had rewritten the rules overnight. Something undeniable was taking root. Leo XIV had spoken with a moral clarity that made every careful, measured institutional response sound like an echo of something already dead in his private quarters. Leo continued his morning prayers, unaware that the world's power structures were learning to navigate around a truth they could neither control nor dismiss. The Vatican gardens held a different kind of silence now. 3 days after Pope Leo XIV had spoken the names of the forgotten to the world, as he walked the same ancient paths where he had carried the weight of unspoken truth. His steps fell lighter on the dew-dampened gravel. The burden that had pressed against his chest for 3 months was gone, replaced by something he had never expected. Peace. Cardinal Martinez found him there, the same spot where Leo had questioned his calling just days before. The older man's face showed the strain of 72 hours of diplomatic crisis management, the emergency meetings with nunzos, the careful responses to world leaders who didn't know how to address a pope who had abandoned the language of institutional authority, but beneath the exhaustion, something else was visible, a grudging respect that hadn't been there before, mixed with something that might have been relief. "The Secretary of State wants to know what you plan to say next," Martinez said, settling onto the stone bench beside his friend. "Half the Vatican is convinced you've started a revolution. The other half thinks you've saved the Church's soul." He paused, studying Leo's profile in the growing light. "The phones haven't stopped ringing since your broadcast ended. Every news organization in the world wants follow-up interviews. The UN Secretary-General's office has called twice asking if you'll address the General Assembly." Leo smiled, watching the first light catch the fountain's spray like scattered diamonds. "What do you think, Alessandro?" "I think," Martinez said, carefully, choosing his words with the precision of 3 decades in Vatican service, "that you did something I've never seen in 30 years here. You made the Church's voice sound human again." He withdrew a tablet from his cassock and showed Leo the screen. "Look at this. Social media mentions of prayer have increased by 400% since your broadcast. Church attendance is up in every major city. People who haven't spoken to their families in years are making phone calls." Leo took the tablet, scrolling through messages that seemed to blur the line between testimony and prayer. A businessman in Shanghai describing how he'd called his estranged brother after hearing Maria Elena's letter, a teenager in Detroit who had started volunteering at a homeless shelter because the Pope reminded me that invisible people matter. A retired teacher in São Paulo who had organized her neighborhood to write letters to local prisoners after hearing Leo read from the detention center. "But the institutions won't know how to follow where you've led," Martinez continued, his voice carrying the weight of institutional memory. "They're built for careful words, not prophetic truth. The Curia is in chaos. 3 different departments have drafted protocols for unscheduled PayPal communications, and none of them know how to categorize what you did. It wasn't a homily, it wasn't an encyclical, it wasn't even technically a PayPal address. It was," he struggled for words, "it was something else entirely." "Then perhaps it's time they learned a new language," Leo replied, his voice carrying the same quiet certainty that had transformed a global broadcast into an act of revelation. "The woman who gave me this cross in Peruche didn't want careful diplomacy, she wanted to be seen. And now the world knows that seeing each other, really seeing each other, is the beginning of everything else." "There's something else," Martinez said quietly. "We've received word from refugee camps, from hospitals, from places where our letters came from. The people, the ones whose names you read, they're being treated differently now." Amaris Camp received a delegation from the International Red Cross yesterday. "Maria Elena has been contacted by 3 human rights organizations offering legal help. It's as if making them visible to the world made them matter to the world." Leo closed his eyes, feeling the weight of that responsibility settle gently on his shoulders, not the crushing burden of institutional expectations, but the sacred weight of human connection. "Do you know what the hardest part was, Alessandro? Not the decision to speak, but the decision to stop speaking for others and start speaking with them. Stop being the voice of God and start being the echo of God's people." In the distance, the bells of St. Peter's began their morning call to prayer, their bronze voices carrying across Rome like a benediction. The sound had tolled over the Vatican for centuries, marking the hours of popes who had spoken in Latin and gold, who had worn the weight of institutional authority like armor. But this morning, the bells seemed to ring with something new, not the call to power, but the invitation to presence. "The revolution has already happened," Leo said, standing slowly from the bench. "Not in the Vatican, not in the world's capitals, but in kitchens and living rooms, in the hearts of people who remembered what it feels like to be seen. That's where the Church has always lived, Alessandro, not in these marble halls, but in the spaces between human souls where love decides to show up despite everything." As they walked back toward the Apostolic Palace, the sun fully risen now and painting the ancient stones in gold, Martinez felt something shift in his understanding of what papal authority could mean. For 30 years, he had served the institution, protecting its dignity and managing its image. But watching Leo these past days, he had glimpsed something older and more powerful. The possibility that the Church's greatest strength might not be its ability to speak with one voice, but its willingness to listen with one heart, and Pope Leo XIV, the man who had broken protocol to speak truth, walked slowly home through gardens that would never sound quite the same again. The revolution had been as quiet as prayer and just as unstoppable.